We'll wait for a couple of minutes and let our audience join. Start after. So hello and welcome to Mindful Conversations, a webinar series that has been organized by the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats and the fourth year Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin College in Ottawa. And today we have three wonderful speakers with us who will be talking to us about cultural space. The talk is titled This Thing Called Cultural Space, featuring Ron Daniel, Ankur Choksi, and Siddharth Talwar in conversation, uh, bringing in historical, theoretical, as well as practice-driven insights into the question of what is cultural space. And it's a great honor to be moderating this session. My name is Pallavi Swaranjali, and I have my organizing team here with me. So please welcome the speakers as well as the team: Sarah McKay, Marlina Dowell, Alison Freya, Bifeng Lin, Fatima Bazayet, and Dong Yan. The whole webinar will be broken up into the presentations by the speakers, followed by a conversation amongst the three of them, as well as a question and answer session afterwards. If you would like to ask a question, please do so in the chat window and we will take it up as we go. If you're watching us on YouTube, there is a chat window there as well where you can put in your questions, and we look forward to discussing those. So our first speaker today is Ron Daniel from Kent State University, and I would request Sarah to give us a brief introduction about him.
Yes, of course. So Ron Daniel is the Intern Interior Design Program Director of the College of Architecture and Environmental Design at Kent State University. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Duke University and a Master of Architecture from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He has practiced professionally with Camiro Limited, Formwork Interior Architecture, and Hopscotch Studio. He is also a member of the Interior Design Educators Council and serves on the review board of the Journal of Interior Design. In 2019, he was named Outstanding Reviewer of the Year. As a design historian, Ron investigates the relationship between interior space, cultural ideas, and technological change. Please welcome Ron Daniel.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Pallavi and the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats for this invitation. I'm also very thankful to Studio Lotus and my partners in this conversation, Ankur and Siddhartha, whose presentation I'm very much looking forward to. My intention is to speak for about 20, no more than 30 minutes, and then hand over the microphone or the screen. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen now. Give me a moment to set this up, if you can bear with me. Let's see. Okay. Does that look okay? Okay, super.
Yes.
Welcome and good morning and good evening, everyone. Here, I'll do this. Whoops. Okay. The prompts for this conversation that were sent to me by the students and by Pallavi led my mind to thinking about the designer, American designer, George Nelson. I think that perhaps George Nelson is less well known than he once was. He was, in the middle years of the century, an enormous and towering figure. He oversaw design at the American furniture company Herman Miller in the decades after World War II, so in the late 40s and 50s up through the 1960s. In that role, he worked with mid-century designers who are perhaps now more famous, like Charles and Ray Eames, Alexander Girard, Isamu Noguchi, and Robert Probst. And as well, he designed numerous pieces himself, most with Herman Miller. And here on the screen are just some of his furniture pieces and accessories. And you can see his range was just enormous. He did, of course, seating, and he did desks and workstations and benches and clocks and accessory pieces, including those marvelous bird's nests down in the center column in the bottom, bird feeders. So in a very real sense, George Nelson helped to give form to the very influential design sensibility we have now named, looking backwards, we call mid-century modern. Perhaps less well known are George Nelson's writings. He was a voracious reader and a voracious thinker. As documented by Lucinda Havenhand in her recent book, Mid-Century Modern Interiors, The Ideas That Shaped Interior Design in America, she describes how George Nelson was just deeply influenced by a whole series of kind of 20th century intellectuals, including the philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset. He was also deeply influenced by his friend, his psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, and as well was in deep conversation with Japanese designers and Japanese aesthetics, and wrote the introduction or the foreword to this very important book that was published in the 1950s, How to Wrap 5 Eggs, about Japanese packaging design and Japanese design, perhaps more generally. Okay. And these are in the yellow, just some of the ideas that he would quote from his dialogue with those sources. And so I present this just to give a little context to the quote that I really want to read from Nelson. And here we have it. So these are his words from 1973. I cannot believe that the creative role for the designer now can be anything other than the production of humane environments. Anything else, given the social context, is anachronistic, inconsequential, egotistical, and empty posturing. The real problem for the designer is not only to find clients. He, and it's sick, must first determine what a humane environment really is. The answers are not available in the supermarket. What seems to be needed is observation, study, interdisciplinary friction and thought directed toward the creation of a new cultural base, which is an indispensable prerequisite for a revised set of social priorities. The human environment is not a slogan. It is a mystery which can only be penetrated by humane people. I think that Nelson frames the matter so clearly here, right, in stating that the design of humane environments is fundamentally a cultural question. To design is to implicate and invoke our beliefs, our imagination, our ethics, our desires, our aesthetic longing for beauty and for wonder. And here, though, I do want to put a very important, maybe enormous asterisk on this quote that I have on the screen. When I say that design is a mode of cultural practice, and emphasis is on the A there. We have many allies in this work. We're not doing this project alone. Our allies include things like music and literature and theater and religion and painting and the cinema and others as well. Let's do this. Not sure why each time I advance the slide, it moves a little, but there we go. I'll keep adjusting. Okay, so some designers have foregrounded very explicitly what it means to play a role as a cultural actor and to see their work as a mode of cultural practice. So here on the screen is a project by Konstantin Melnikov. He was a Russian architect who was practicing in a revolutionary society. This is in the years immediately following the Soviet Revolution, right? For the younger students, as inconceivable as it is for us to think about, like Russia entered the 20th century with a king, okay, like a feudal system. And the king was called Tsar in Russia, who was overthrown by the communist revolution. And as part of the revolutionary project, I mean, obviously it was a complete reordering of Soviet society that would take place over decades, but as part of that work, the Soviet political leaders and cultural leaders started to imagine new cultural forms for everyday working people. And so they imagined the construction of these neighborhood cultural palaces, that's what they call them, which were for everyday workers, for homemakers and for factory workers and for truck drivers. And that these would be places that would belong not to the elites of religion or aristocratic political class, but belong to the people. And the most famous of all is Melnikov's design, the Rusakov Workers Club, that was finished in Moscow in 1929. So these were amazing spaces. There were I don't know, about a dozen of these that were actually constructed approximately in the Soviet Union. And they had very kind of surprising and interesting program for us now. They were part theater, where you could go to see plays. They were also part public library. They were part dance hall. They were part brew pub, and they were part gymnasium. The collage that you see, the drawing collage here, is by a constructivist artist named Alexander Danenka, and the title translates approximately into English as "At the District Club." So here, this is not, this is a kind of imagined section for these culture palaces more generally. Another Soviet constructivist designer, Ivan Leonidov, has this very famous quote, which he's sort of talking about the program of these new kind of spaces, and he imagines them to be conductors and condensers of a new socialist culture. So quite explicitly in these projects, and in the Rusakov Club specifically here, I'll put this up here, we have on the screen plans and sections. And then I have never seen an interior of the Rusakov Club, hard to say. But here, another famous of the culture palaces, the Zuev Club, an interior photograph from the late 1920s. It's easy to see that and to understand that these were buildings and projects whose goal was explicitly to create new forms of culture. So to think about them as cultural space does not take, I think, a great deal of insight or imagination. They're super interesting projects. They're amazing to think about, and they are revolutionary and transformative settings. But these are clearly kinds of cultural spaces. And they're not alone in this. There have been, throughout the 20th century, all kinds of projects that were committed to building new forms of culture. The next one I'll say is just aesthetically one of my favorites. Which is not an important thing to say, but nice to look at. And here you're looking, we're set in San Francisco in the late 1960s. And in a building which was first constructed, the year 1912, it was built as the Majestic Dance Hall and Dance Academy. It was in an Italian neighborhood for training, taking dance classes and having weekend dances, ballroom dancing. And then when that fell into decline, it was reconverted into an indoor roller skating rink. And then after that, it was reconverted into a jazz club. And then in the mid 1960s, it was sort of passed down to, after a kind of murder and a whole complex set of things, very famous, who would go on to become a very famous music producer named Bill Graham, who set up this space as a kind of incubator for what we now call the counterculture, as a shorthand way to say that might be, use the word, the San Francisco hippies, okay? And it was, Bill Graham turned it into a kind of event and music venue. And so if you were in San Francisco in 1967, you could go into this space and you could see music acts, neighborhood music acts like the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane and Santana. And then also, this became one of the most important stops in the global tour for the kind of rising rock and roll counterculture, as well as jazz counterculture. And you would maybe be able to see people, or performances by The Who and Aretha Franklin and Miles Davis and Otis Redding. The lighting effects that you see were actually produced by a man named Danny Williams, who was a collaborator and friend and participant with Andy Warhol in an event, a sort of performance happening that was called The Exploding Plastic Inevitable, which was part a music show, part a lighting experience, part an art exhibit. And it featured the music of Nico, was the singer, and the band Velvet Underground. But they designed these series of lighting gels and overhead projectors and multiple films running projecting across the space. And although The Exploding Plastic Inevitable didn't leave a lot of, didn't resonate with the music tastes of San Francisco at that time, they left their lighting setup behind. And so it became part of the Fillmore Auditorium for these really tremendous and amazing few years. And in a very real sense, the community and culture that was incubated in this space, this so-called hippies or the counterculture, is credited with launching some of the most important cultural changes in the 20th century. And those, in shorthand, and obviously these stories are very complex, but things are cultural changes like the youth rebellions that happen around the world, the sexual revolution, the beginning of the gay rights movement, the Western adoption of Eastern spirituality, early forms of environmentalism, and also even as credited by Steve Jobs' biographer, a really important kind of early moment in the rise of the internet culture in the sort of counterculture of San Francisco in these years. Okay. So, okay, it makes sense that in a revolutionary society and in places like cultural venues like a concert hall or a music performance hall, that the idea of cultural space seems sort of self-evident, seems obvious, right? There are new worlds to be constructed or new sensibilities to be created and then fed. But my argument is that it is just as true in interiors that have no cultural ambitions at all, or seemingly no cultural ambitions, in rooms that are built for commerce or for sporting events or for training the young, or halls in which to dine. All of these rooms, culture is being produced and manifested and performed. So I want to make that more explicit by showing you guys what for me has been one of the most haunting photographs of my whole career. I've probably looked at this photograph 70 times, 150 times, I'm not sure. I look at it multiple times a year, multiple times, and I am always overwhelmed as I think about this. This photograph truly does haunt me. At a practical level, let's just describe what it is. You're looking at something called the Order Entry Department of the Sears and Roebuck Company. So it was taken in Chicago in 1913. For the younger audience, Sears and Roebuck Company was like the Amazon of the early 20th century. It was a catalog warehouse, and it was a printed catalog, not a digital internet one, but it was bigger than Amazon actually, and more influential. This room was just one small part of an enormous complex of buildings and rail yards that were centered in Chicago that sort of from all over North America, people would send in their orders on little slips of paper with checks, banking checks, and that those orders would find their way into this room where they would be inputted and processed, which is what these women clerks are doing as they're entering this information. And then the goods would be gathered. You could order pants and violins and cooking equipment and farm tools, and you could order whole prefabricated buildings or components, like they would be, in all their manufactured parts, and they would be put into crates and then shipped by railroads and then dropped off in little villages, small towns all over North America and big cities at the railroad stations. And so this was, as I say, kind of the easiest way for us to think about this as the Amazon of its day, okay? And what we see here hundreds of women. I've tried to count. I think it's over 250. It gets a little fuzzy at the back, right? I lose heads become just pixels. And they're almost all wearing identical white blouses, and they're seated in front of these machines. We know them to be called typewriter machines. They're seated in, kind of fixed rows. The typewriters are mounted on identical desks. The women are mounted on identical chairs as they sit before the machines. And what they're doing is that they are processing and inputting the orders into the Sears kind of inventory system. We recognize this image at once. We have a word for this. We call this an office, right? It's an enormous industrial scaled office. It surprises us, but we see it as an office. It's a place of administrative control, or here, very rigid administrative control, tracking inventory, counting money, filing documents, coordinating production. Those are the things that happen in offices. We also see it as a very modern interior space, right? We see precast concrete columns, we see cast concrete columns, we see electric lighting, pendant lighting hanging down from the underside of the slab. We see mechanical heating and ventilating system blowing from these ductwork in the back. So, and then of course, and if you haven't noticed this, it's even a more haunting part of this. As far as I can tell, I think there's only a single man in this photograph. He stands in the back left corner, and he is the overseer, right? He is surveilling, watching, looking on the work of these hundreds of women clerks who are sitting, addressing themselves to these typing machines. What makes, so like clearly this is an interior which was designed and built for efficiency and for order and control. And yet I would say here, even here, culture is being produced, it's being manifested, and it's being performed. What makes a space like this even imaginable? What forces, what habits, what ideas, what beliefs, what ideals bring a room like this into being? So when I look at this, I see that, or I think that, and think about that the order entry department is, to me, a cultural space. So it's hard for us to remember this, but I think it's an important bit of context to provide. A generation or two before that photograph was taken, the office building did not even exist. It was not a space type. On the left hand, the column on the left, this is a painting by Hans Holbein, and it depicts a German merchant in London. So this is in the time of the Renaissance, and in England, it would have been the early Renaissance. And we have a merchant. We see he's in a tiny space. He's in something that looks like a small bedroom size. He has a few rails to pile his, or to fold his notes on. He might have had a spike. He might have had a book or two for his correspondences. He might have had a runner, like an assistant, to deliver messages throughout the city. And that was how office administrative functions were conducted for centuries. So we go into the 1800s, and here is an illustration by for one of Charles Dickens' novels of a counting house, and then below an example from the United States, that office spaces were in the corner of warehouses, or they were in small bedroom type spaces, or maybe a chapter house of a church. That's where the administration functions, things that happen in offices, would have taken place. But then by the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, something obviously very important shifts. And so in this like beautiful haunting photograph by Alfred Stieglitz, has the title of Old and New New York. We see the kind of pre-industrial city, which its buildings and spaces, some of these would have been business-like functions. They might have been warehouses. They might have been residences. They certainly weren't like what is rising behind them, the new age, the age of the skyscraper, which was primarily and mostly built for office space. Okay. Furthermore, again, a generation or two before that photograph was taken, it would have been unimaginable to have had women working in clerical functions, women working in office-like functions. This is a misogynistic cartoon from sometime in the 1880s or 1890s, and the title is Employment of Women, ? And here is a sort of 19th century clerk who comes in to supervise the work of these, what were at that time a very new idea that women might be able to be in the workplace. And he, of course, is scandalized by the ledger books on the floor, the gossiping, the chit-chatting, the slovenly body postures, the spilled ink, right? This is like, no, like women, of course, are not suitable. This would have been the belief at the time, to be working in an office. And this is right, just a generation before that photograph is taken. And then, of course, there are new technological and social devices that enter the mix. So in the 1870s, this is the first kind of commercially successful, we would now call them typewriter. They were sometimes called writing machines or printing machines. They were ways to industrialize the writing process and actually to de-skill it, which is to say that it was possible to simply push these buttons and have the correspondences then be printed out. So although typewriters were used a little bit by certain writers, maybe most famously by Mark Twain, mostly they were used to record and print correspondences which were written by someone else, which was almost always men, right, who would either dictate through shorthand or through early forms of audio recording to clerical workers who would then print and process the letters. And so this machine, just real quick, it was seen as a gendered machine. It looked sort of like a sewing machine. It operated sort of like a piano keyboard, which was something that cultured young women were expected to know how to do. And so all of that is churning in the background of that photograph, as well as all of the other things, the layers of context which surround that photograph, things that are not visible in the photo, but that surround it. An industrially booming city full of electrification and railroad networks. This is Chicago just a few years earlier, downtown in 1909. New communications technologies, the telegraph, then later the telephone, the mail system, waves of immigrants, public school for women, shifting ideas of social propriety, all of those forces, which are complex, overlapping conditions of technological change and economic change and social changes and cultural changes, are all happening at the same time, and that allow this room, something like this room, to come into being. Certainly, its designers had no ambitions to make a cultural space, but I say very much, absolutely, it is a cultural space. Late British critic and theorist Robin Evans said it so plainly and so best. So I'll just quote his words. Ideas about the nature of things are built into the structures of our surroundings. And I inserted into that ideas about the cultural nature, the political, social, economic, and technical nature of things are built into our surroundings. Okay? So that when we look at spaces, we see the echoes and ripples and effects of cultural ideas implementing themselves into our world. And it's true in an example like this. So this is the Arrivals Hall at Ellis Island, which was an island just south of New York City, where ultimately 10 million immigrants would be processed. It's amazing to think about that today in the United States, 100 million Americans can trace their ancestors having passed through this single room. Okay, and in this room was created a new notion, a 20th century notion of a multi-ethnic immigrant society. It was brought into being in this room, which doesn't belong in design history textbooks. It's not a great design of anything. It's not particularly interesting, right? But it was a kind of vital cultural space for the forming of a kind of new vision of a kind of multi-ethnic democratic country. Looking a little bit later into the 20th century, here we're in Orlando, Florida. We're in Disney World, the hotel that was built in 1971 called the Contemporary Resort Hotel, and looking at its interior atrium, which was called the Grand Canyon Concourse, designed by Welton Beckett and the Walt Disney Company, and then the mural that you can see, the vertical, mosaic that you can see in the rear, was by the famous Disney animator Mary Blair. This was a room that was constructed in what, in hindsight, we can see clearly that, of course, they didn't know at the time, was the last years of a booming post-World War II American consumer prosperity, right? The good life for individuals, for small nuclear families, was to be available for purchase. It was a world of shopping malls and television screens and the wonders of disposable plastics. There was a tremendous confidence in the power of technology that had, of course, won the World War and split the atom and bringing all kinds of new futures to reality. And then this was, of course, adjacent to, it was a hotel in support of the Disney theme parks, which brilliantly fed a kind of appetite for simulated experiences, maybe appetite that had been cultivated on television, travel without dangers, Main Street without potholes, and American history without any genocide. In this vast room with its monorail and its plastic trees, you can see these amazing trees in the foreground, and the soaring void and the stylized mosaic, which is a kind of like mosaic of Native Americans. It's quite credible to contemplate on. And also all the hotel's rooms were prefabricated modules. All of the wonders and contradictions of this late mid-century moment are, in the words of Robin Evans, again, built into the structure of our surroundings. I have to go a little faster. I'll speed up, but I'll finish soon. This is the SS Normandy, and it was built to be a speedster, one of the great steamships to travel between France and then it would stop in England and then go to New York. It could make it across the Atlantic Ocean in 4 days. It was the fastest steamship that had been ever built in its time. I think maybe even since. And at its center sat one of the great, maybe the most important Art Deco interior in the whole 20th century, was the dining room of the SS Normandy. So we're looking at here a dining room inside the middle of a giant machine. So this is not a building, it's an interior inside of a machine. And this was a room that could seat 700 people. The glass was by the French designer René Lalique. There's glass sort of chandeliers on the ceiling, and then these towers on the floor and the sconces on the walls. There were these bronze doors by the artist Raymond Soubet, and then the designers Roger Henri Expert and Pierre Patou was the interior designer of this room. This was an incredible space. It had air conditioning, which was kind of novel at the time, so that women would come to dinner in their furs and men in their tuxedos. They would eat on custom designed china with the finest French chefs. This was, of course, a room for the most elite society, right, in the Art Deco age. So even with all of this technology around it, all of this kind of like wonderful inventions, what mattered most in this room were the cultural dynamics that took place in here. Okay, it's in this photograph without people. We have to imagine it, right? Who looked at whom, who and what was on display. How did the social classes operate? What spices, what tastes were fashionable to savor? Who fell in love? Who cemented business deals? Who whispered secrets? Who was invited in and who was banished as being unworthy? So my thesis is pretty simple. You can say it in 5 words, right? And this is sort of the point of this whole talk. I see all spaces as being cultural spaces. And I will close with one last example to try to bring that home. And it is not a room so much as a furniture series, sorry. Here we can see it, designed by Robert Probst and George Nelson, who I started with for the Herman Miller Company, and it's called the Action Office. And it was first released as a product in 1964. It was a modular furniture system, probably the most important successful furniture system that was released in the 20th century. It is given credit for good or for bad as being the first workplace systems furniture product. Herman Miller, I think, still makes an Action Office product, but of course, well developed from this. But this was the parent design for what would become infamously and depressingly the cubicle farms of the 1980s and 1990s. It's really simple. Its elements are really simple. It's modular legs and integrated shelving and wiring. It had some storage bins and repositionable work surfaces and privacy panels, exactly the parts or pieces that you would expect. But as I have written about elsewhere, it's impossible to think about and to understand the Action Office, I believe, without positioning it within its context of the Cold War, the kind of global cultural conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. That conflict was a geopolitical one. It was a military one, thank goodness not directly, usually always indirectly, an economic and cultural struggle between 2 large, geopolitical blocks, adversarial blocks. On the screen, just some of those contexts that sit around the Action Office. The United States Central Intelligence Agency, the spy agency, used modernism absolutely as a kind of cultural weapon against the Soviet Union. So here, this is an exhibit in Berlin called Building a Better building a better Berlin, to show off the progressiveness of the West. The technologies of the Cold War were positioned inside the Action Office. The Bell telephone system, which sat on every desk, the early computers were all parts of the defense technologies. This is a photograph actually in Canada, north of the Arctic Circle, of a NATO radar array to track imagined Soviet bombers that were somehow gonna come over the North Pole. And then here on the bottom left, a very famous photograph of Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, and US Vice President Richard Nixon, debating the design of kitchens, the so-called kitchen debate, and appliances as being kind of symbols or testaments to the superiority of one system or another. To be at work in an office was to be operating like a pilot. And Robert Probst, in his theorizing and writing about the Action Office, said this quite explicitly, that the office was a cockpit to command and deploy resources. To be a businessman in the Action Office, and it was definitely, let me just say, originally imagined for men. These are, what you're seeing are like the original publicity photographs, was to be the very model of a free man of the West, decisive, progressive, transparent, flexible, and effective. A man of action, a Cold War cultural warrior, embodying the best virtues of a free and dynamic society. Okay. So very much I see that when we say design is a mode of cultural practice, that is meant to empower what it means to be a designer. It elevates the stakes, I think, of what we try to do, in that it connects us in a way that George Nelson said so explicitly to the most profound questions and possibilities of our own lives. And so that to imagine our work as a cultural practice is to ask what new shapes for the world, what new forms of culture, more just, more liberatory, more delightful, might we create tomorrow? Okay. Thank you, everyone. Those are my thoughts. Sorry, I went a little long. I look forward to the conversation to come.
Thank you, Ron. I don't think you went long. It was so perfectly timed. And I think your whole presentation was a very powerful reminder. The argument that you have is so potent that all spaces are cultural spaces, or design is a mode of cultural practice. And I think this reminder that culture is, as you said, produced, manifest, and performed in spaces is such a nice framework to then welcome our next presenters with. This framework that you've provided, and then probably something that Ankur and Siddharth will bring in next will be very interesting to listen to with that background, I would say. So I would call Fatima and Marlina to welcome our next speakers from Studio Lotus, Ankur Choksi and Siddharth Talwar.
So to introduce Studio Lotus, it's a New Delhi-based multidisciplinary design practice that Siddhartha Talwar and Ankur Choksi co-founded with Ambrish Arora in 2002, spanning the domains of master planning, architecture, and interior design. The work of the award-winning practices is grounded on the principles of conscious design, an approach that celebrates local resources, cultural influences, and inclusive process, and keen attention to details. Studio Lotus' work is internationally recognized, winning numerous awards nationally and internationally. Their practices, projects, and writings have been published extensively in trade and non-trade journals globally. To further introduce the speakers, my colleague Marlina will take over.
So Siddhartha Talwar leads the architecture and master planning initiatives for the practice, working extensively on large-scale developments for a diverse clientele with a focus on spatial articulation, environmental planning, and sustainable and modular construction methodologies. He is also an active member of the Indian Architectural Fraternity through educating design competitions and speaking at trade events, and represents the practice on a global stage. Ankur Choksi leads the integrated architecture and interior design initiatives for the practice, focusing on hospitality, branded experiences, and adaptive reuse projects. He is also an active proponent of quality design education and advocates for the principles of conscious design pan-India through academic engagement and design conclaves alike. Please welcome Siddhartha and Ankur, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Pallavi, and thank you the entire team for having us here. And just very quickly, I'll give, because both of us are going to talk about it, we've got a little structure in place. I'm going to start off talking about the concerns that we would like to raise. And Ron, thank you. I think you created a very interesting ground, and in a way, we have a similar proposition in terms of our argument around the idea of cultural space. And we are going to use our context and our projects to demonstrate how we respond to it and what we think about it. And between me and Siddharth, we'll kind of take on projects to talk in depth about. So I'll just quickly share my screen and start off.
By the time Ankur starts, I would like to add, thank you, Pallavi, for inviting us. And thank you, Ron, for a very powerful presentation. I've made a lot of notes and trying to jot on a lot of connections. And as we will go along in our presentation, I see a lot of, a lot of resonance in what you have spoken and to what we do. Something which really captured like design is a mode of cultural practice, especially in our Indian context with the geographic, variety which we have and the climatic regions which we have. And then on top of it, when you add culture. So, it's like we've just realized, and in fact, I've just realized, like, as a stakeholder, we have so many stakeholders, and while we are working with so many of them, it's almost like a cultural mela, I would say. And then we kind of juggle around whether we are in the north of India or in the south of India, and the kind of connections we make, it's quite remarkable. So and these points came up to me. Probably we'll talk about it and go a bit more detail later.
Yeah, thanks, Sid. So yeah, I'll start right where Sid, what Sid was talking about. I think for us, especially in India, there is this huge kind of backdrop of the amount of coexistence of the amount of communities, architectural vocabularies, climatic conditions, socio-cultural kind of differences. So of course they throw up challenges, but they are also as exciting because of the richness that they provide. So there's just so many layers that one needs to deal with when one is building on a project. And India offers this very unusual kind of position, where there's this coexistence of hundreds of years together. So the time kind of ceases in a way, but it's still flowing, and there are contemporary expressions sitting right with things the way they would have existed hundreds of, at least 200-300 years back, right? And there is so much wisdom in terms of construction methodologies or crafts and skills, hand skills, which are available, which could be harnessed. So there's a lot of wisdom that's available to kind of put to new use and make it relevant for our times and what we kind of need in our times today. And then we also we're looking at culture as this idea of, it's very cyclic. It's not linear. The way culture develops, it kind of space, culture, and time have a very, it's an amazing relationship, because a space kind of gets informed by the culture it kind of sits in, and the kind of space, like what Ron spoke about, like the kind of spaces also modulate and kind of create a culture and help influence a culture or build a culture. So there is this very interesting relationship of what you imbibe from the past and kind of bring into our present. And in a way, what you're doing in the present informs what's going to happen in the future. So this relationship is what we really believe we could contribute to. And I think that's where we wanted to kind of lean the conversation towards, where what we're saying is that, it's very evident that culture shapes architecture, but again, Ron pointed to the same things, that is there a way the way and we are just kind of zooming out, and we're saying that can be practice design in a way which shapes culture, which kind of creates our response to the society and the environment. And I think in a way that's exactly what we also were trying to put across as an argument. Could we consider that spaces, in some sense, all the spaces are in some sense our cultural spaces? We are going to focus on some of the key interest areas that we work with, which help us build a story or kind of help us build a basis of how we go about creating our design process. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the facets that we use and which are of interest to us. So we really try and look at every project and dig kind of deep into the brief to create a story around the project, from the expression of the building or the actual build form, all the way down to how it's getting built, what impact is it creating, what is it going to influence finally as an outcome. We also feel that this whole sinking ourselves into the cultural roots and practices allows us to create a distinctive identity. Internationally or globally, there is a certain sense of homogeneous character that architecture started to take shape. And somewhere this idea of responding locally, looking at, especially in India for us as a practice, contemporizing craft has been a very important area, looking at craft and bringing it into architecture and interior design, and how it can help us build a identity for the space and give it a sense of place. And finally, I think when we zoom out, we often always look at the larger picture from the point of view of, again, something that Siddharth spoke about, like how is it influencing or impacting everyone across the process. Of course, the clients are the starting point and the commercial interests of the business. But beyond that, like when you look at the communities it's going to touch in terms of as an experience, or the community that's going to engage with it in terms of building the place or articulating the place and creating it for the client. And then finally, the larger questions of how we are responding to sustainability, how we are responding to the way the material is being used. All those questions come up, and that's very important for us. So in that sense, this whole idea of everything kind of speaks to the culture and creates a new culture is very alive for us. We really try and look at our work as something that can kind of influence and create a new way of looking at things and shift paradigms for people. So Sid, you can jump in if you want to add something here. Then I'm going to use some projects to demonstrate some of these ideas and how we are kind of using them in our projects.
Yeah, so for Patiala Crafts Mela, probably this was one of our very first projects which we had to set it up in actually a month's time. And we created a, 1 second, Ankur.
Oh, sorry, I need to share. Yeah, you have the access. Sorry.
Is it okay? No.
Yeah. You got it?
Nope.
Good. Probably you will have to advance the.
Yeah, no, sorry, we had figured out a remote access, but somehow Zoom is misbehaving right now. We just checked it. Anyways, so Sid, I'll just continue on Patiala and then maybe you can pick up KB. Yeah. I think the screen. Okay. Yeah, so this was an opportunity we got very early on in our practice, and the Patiala government and Intact kind of invited us to create a model for an annual event of a gathering and a community event which would act also as a temporary marketplace for craft to kind of be shared across a state. So it was an annual state event. And we took on this challenge of, interpreting it only in fabric and bamboo. The idea was to actually do something. So this fair consecutively kind of happened for over about 8-10 years, and they used the same system. So we developed something as a vocabulary for them, which gave a very strong sense of celebration, which kind of evoked the spirit of Punjab, the bright use of color. And we ended up creating these architectural expressions which would move with the breeze and behave, kind of respond to the moving sun through the day, and shielded the craft grounds. But the whole idea was to do something in a fairly frugal way. So it was very low cost, and yet it created a very strong kind of identity. And it was kind of exploratory. So every year we used to try out different explorations in fabric and bamboo. It also made the team very kind of excited to keep going at it every year. So there was a wild exploration of color, and kind of it brought in this spirit of Mela, which was interpreted
and in the
a very
time frame
structured form. Yeah.
And in the time frame which we need to really make it happen, actually, I remember a lot of, the ladies from the vicinity and from the town, they all came together. The amount of bamboo and the amount of fabric work to be done, from the extent of dyeing those colors, from the extent of cutting them. Fulkari is a very interesting part of the in the vocabulary, and the whole process came in together as a community. About 100 of the ladies were working day and night, 100 of people working day and night to put all this together. So in fact, it was like a little community, a kind of a show to be brought up in very quick time frame. And then that's what probably our early steps to see, how from all facets and from all areas people come together and put it up. It was quite something which was quite moving for us very early on.
Yeah. So this was actually probably the second year of our practice. So it's one of those projects which almost helped us sail through as well in terms of moving forward. And then this is a slightly more recent project, which is where we were invited by the Crafts Museum grounds of Delhi. And it's an historical building that they wanted us to bring in intervention and activate a certain portion of the Crafts Museum grounds. And we were actually working on the store and an extension, which is a cafe, which was kind of an idea that we inserted to create a hub and bring in an F&B experience to activate the proposition. So earlier, there was a very small cafe, but we kind of worked with them to create a larger footprint for it. So the whole master plan was changed around it. We moved the facilities in a way where the whole front area could be activated. And again, it was done in a very, very simple methodology, but it used all the elements, used the craftsmen, and it became like a canvas for them. So every expression in the space had some customized or kind of personal expression sitting on it, from stonework to there's the thickery work on the walls, and then even a very light metal structure, which is actually like a very simple L section structure that was created to shield the outdoor areas and put the cafe there as with a bamboo layer as a shading device. And that also became like a canvas, and a hand painted kind of detail took over and brought in life to those elements. So the columns kind of got rendered with hand-drawn artworks. the building itself, the key walls and experiences was articulated. So we cleaned up the old building. We kind of elevated the store experience, and then brought in the artists selectively to start creating a patchwork of artworks over the entire architectural and architectural facade that they had available. And the space itself was very crisp, and we created a system for them to work with their retail display. And that's how the space kind of got cleaned up and articulated. So that's an old building that's just been kind of opened up, and there were areas which were not bringing in daylight. So we selectively kind of opened up the building, brought in daylight, and then articulated the building facade.
So,
I hope that you can run it now. Yeah.
but you'll be,
I've given you the access. No.
1 second.
Got it?
Yeah, I've
Or-
done. Not. Would you only navigate then? I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah.
able-
You continue. I'll keep doing it.
Yeah, this Krishi Bhavan Bhubaneswar is a government project which we did for the Soil and Agricultural Directorate for Odisha. And perhaps for us, it's again, a complete paradigm shift from what we had been doing earlier to after the completion of this building. This was to essentially house the offices for the Soil and Agricultural Department. It started with that, but while we were into the project, and it was a CM's mandate he was like in a way very interestingly involved in the project. So while we were into the project, the upper level, the idea was to how a government building become a lively point for all kinds of public life. We were looking at the city principle, like Bhubaneswar is a city designed earlier by Königsberger, and we started investigating how that city design was done. And in fact, even at that point, the idea was the city to be opened up to the public. And in today's day and age, all the government buildings are surrounded by solid boundary wall. It becomes very, autocratic in that nature. But here we thought that how, the city and the street can come into the building. So we created a kind of a seamless ground plane, like a stilted plane below, which kind of interacted with the streets on either end, and then the upper part became where the government offices are, and then they operate. So the lower plane became where the farmers could come in. Essentially, there were facilities added purely for the farmers and for their engagement and interaction. It became like a little hut or an exhibition space for engagements to happen. And in fact, it got opened up further to the citizens of Bhubaneswar for them to come and again interact with each other, with the government officials on top. And in fact, we went up further, and even the rooftop became an active engagement point. So we could see at some point where the farmers, citizens, and the government officials could become integrated. Next one, Ankur. So as I mentioned earlier, the whole ground stilted plane had a variety of events and facilities provided. We created space for landscape. We created space for an auditorium, which could again either be for the farmers' events or even for the citizens, for the public as well. There were nodal officers where the farmers can come and interact with the government officials. So it became like a very active point, the ground plane. Ankur?
Yeah.
After creating the physical aspect of the building, we went into the architectural expression, and how the architectural expression of this building could be something, could we go back? Could be something which can really work again the context of Odisha. So this CM is a patronage of art, and he wanted the craft and the local mediums to be interpreted at an architectural scale. So we looked at ikat as a weaving pattern. Next one, and how the facade of the building could become like a woven pattern in ikat. So we created mud blocks in 4 colors, and how the pixelation of those mud blocks overlaying the ikat pattern creates the architectural facade of the building. And this is how it was rendered in elevation. The lower plane, the stilted lower plane, is in local material called laterite and chondrolite, where the upper 2, in fact, it became 3 floors, became a pixelation of ikat. It's a double skin structure. So there are windows behind, but the exterior facade, which is meant to again allow the wind and cut the sun, became this pattern on the facade. Yeah. And that's how it kind of manifests itself in the physical form. It's at, again, the lower plane has a lot of intricate carving work done. We engaged with almost 60 artisans across the state, and there were screens, there were relief work being done in laterite, talking about the paddy fields. So it became almost like a storytelling device at the lower plane. We could engage with the craftsmen for over 6 months. And then they created mythological stories, creating these screens and jalis. And in fact, Patichitra and the mythological folklores were kind of, carved into stone, into the local stone. And it became like a storytelling device. Again, as I mentioned, the porous steel plane became like an interaction point, and a point to meet for the citizens and the farmers to come and interact with each other. Yeah. And then the local form, dhokra form, became screens. The whole corridors were semi-covered. They were non-air conditioned. Next one. Yeah. This is our next project, which was a competition, and we won it. It was a competition set up by Aga Khan Foundation for Culture. And it's in Hyderabad. It's the Qutub Shahi Heritage Park Interpretation Center. Next one, Ankur. The context of this project, as you can see, is that it's part of a Deccan park, and it has got these 7 tombs, Qutub Shahi tombs, over various centuries, which have been built. And the idea was to create again a visitor center for the people seeking information, because Aga Khan is restoring these tombs. So they wanted a point where there could be some more information seeking can happen. And again, we created the plinth as a reference, where we saw a lower plinth and then a higher plinth and then tomb. So we saw how the lower plinth as a marker can become our building. And we kind of don't go beyond that plinth. So we, in a way, the framework was that we looked at the contour of the land, and we sunk the building while we had to engage the different forms of circulation for visitors, crisscrossing between this and the tombs. But we, in a way, we created these access with the tombs, but we sunk the building inside so that it becomes like a sunken non-building to retain the majestic glory of the tombs. Yeah, next one. And that's how, as a starting point, it kind of sits across, where the tomb is on the left, and the upper part, the series of plinths, became the roof gardens for people to come and engage. And the facilities are a kind of below it. So here you can clearly see the section where the red line is the existing contour, but we kind of merged the building, sunk into the contour. And then the plane created on the top becomes an extension of the land to be used by the people visiting. Next one, please. And again, while we had to create these retaining walls, which we did in masonry, again, there is always, again, as Ron mentioned about the culture nuances built into the building methodology, we thought how it can be easily made, how, it does not really get into a lot of concrete. So trying to get minimal concrete, we inserted a steel structure, like a woven steel structure, to create the spans. We have stone walls, high stone walls creating the inner partition walls, and a tukri slab, like large scale tukri slab, stone slab, which we took inference of what we saw at the tombs, becoming the roof of the building. We created skylights for passive air cooling and to get in light. And again, how the slab becomes like a crafted narrative. We are doing relief work into it, and the upper slab being the greens. So this is again the construction principles of the building. And then how we've done daylight optimization and the flow of the ventilation, which is again critical. That created the section of a building. Yeah, next one, please. And again, as the architectural narrative, we again kind of looked at the context behind, which was around us, and we started integrating into our form. We saw the local granite, we saw the masonry walls around. The next one, please. And that's how it's under construction now by the government of Telangana. But that's, you go into the orientation code. We have a water body as a welcoming feature. We have these solid stone walls again made, which has metal and then cladded with stone. There are courtyards to bring in light. There is local masonry on the left, and again you can see metal as a structure. Ramps were created to take care of the contours. And the metal structure has these large span tukri slab, each slab is about 1800 by 900 mm, which has relief work in it. Yeah. And then now, after the building gets commissioned, it will get into the museum bit, where this is more of a ideation done. We have to still work in further in detail with the government, but that's how the museum gets populated by artifacts and by information around. And yeah, and even the cafe, there is a large eating area where again a lot of jalis and were created. A lot of small details were done to bring in light, and that's how the building sits on the top with these skylights and the greens on top, so that it becomes a usable area, and the passages are interlinked. So all the movements are planned out. While there is a movement at the lower area going through the museum, there is movement even at the upper level going into the tombs. Yeah. And the prototyping work is happening, where we have done the metal structure with the local stone and the etching done into it. It's a work in progress. We're going to refine it further. And why again we put all this is again bringing back to Ron's point about culture. Like I've spent days over there, working with the local craftsmen, working with the local team, and how, in fact, over the process of the day, while you are from different contexts and languages, but spending over 2 full days, like how they can understand what we are saying. And then, doing prototyping live brings in again a lot of integration and connections together. It is not so easy because you're from different backgrounds and languages, but I think the only medium is to really work together, spend time, do prototyping. And I've seen over 2 days we've spent time and created these the actual prototyping, like how we could spend few hours integrating the stone onto the columns. I took these and we put this because it took over 3 hours to really make it happen, but it did happen. Like government is still not easy to work with, but with the support of the government and with the support of the local people, we could make what we had envisaged earlier.
Yeah. So I'll just take a few examples of. We've been doing this kind of work of engaging with the local building techniques and crafts on various projects, and probably Ambrish also shared this project, so I'll move a little quickly on this one. But this was one of our first hotel projects, and we really wanted to retain the sensibility of this, or kind of the scale of the 3 old spaces and the courtyard. So the buildings were positioned in a way, the new inserts were positioned in a way that we would bring minimum disturbance to the central courtyard. And then we had to find a new vocabulary for the contemporary buildings, which were the inserts that we were putting in for the hotel block. So it's a 42 key hotel, and we wanted to spread them around and not to create a heavy mass on the site. So the first building actually is the primary hotel block, which creates a gateway into the central courtyard. And it has beautiful lines of sites to the fort, and that became the key premise of the entire development. And somewhere the idea was to, because we were in the old town of Jodhpur, to retain the sense of legacy and heritage that we had all around, and build on the story of the history, but do something that was in kind of juxtaposition with that. So the entire new building built, so the old building was kind of cleaned up. So there were layers of plaster and a lot of buildup that had happened over the years. It was not kept well. That was cleaned up. And then we brought in techniques of lime plaster for the central building, dressed up the building back to what it could have been or might have been in its old glory. And we retained elements that we thought were fit for the present programmatic requirements. So this space becomes like an accent space, which holds the entire hotel experience together in the evenings and through the day. It's the all-day dining space with a large veranda space outside, open to sky space outside, which kind of connects to the swimming pool. And then the entire building skin was devised using this old idea of a stone wall, which cuts off thermal. It creates a thermal mass to protect the building from the sun, the harsh sun of Rajasthan. So we worked with the local craftsmen in stone. And here, I'll just like to pick up this idea of, Ron, what you were talking about, how architecture can in some way, so it was very rewarding. We were able to kind of influence the pride and the joy, bring back the pride and joy to the local artisans to a degree, because they got to do something very different. And it has become like an iconic piece, which is very contemporary. It's kind of revived their skill and given it a new meaning. So in a very small way, the team felt very fulfilled that they were able to contribute to this large community of stone workers in Jodhpur. And a lot of explorations were done with them. We have a very collaborative way of working with. That's what we really enjoy, working with these craftsmen. So all these interpretations were done by them, and then we kind of structured it and put it as an articulation for our interior spaces. So this idea of handcrafted became like a big thing in this hotel. The floors are all hand poured terrazzo with stone inlay in it, and the bathrooms are completely hand kind of cast in terrazzo. So terrazzo is this technique of mixing stone and cement together and then kind of buffing it. So it works really well to give a very tactile experience, and that elevates the end user's experience. And the hotel actually is positioned as one of the most luxurious kind of hotel in Jodhpur, and it sits in the middle of the old town of Jodhpur. The main skin brings in dapple light through the day, protects the actual glass skin of the building from the sun, and creates a barrier. And what we had to do was engineer this stone skin to be an openable skin, because all the rooms had views to the fort, and the idea was to give them that opportunity of creating like a balcony that opened up. So a lot of time was spent engineering. So it uses hardware from like it's kind of customized using a international hardware, but it's got a customized solution. So it's an interesting mix, because one found it difficult to come up with a solution as a ready-made product. So there was like Siddharth was saying, the prototyping is an integral part of how we work, and that helps us explore and come up with solutions which are distinctive. So the whole building animates through the day, as and when the client kind of opens up the facade and the building changes its shape, and it's very playful. And that's your experience of the site as we had found it. So all the old buildings are dressed up almost in a very similar feel to the fort. It kind of pulls the fort into the premise of the hotel. for the same client, we've recently done another project where we've taken this story forward. So it sits on an old reservoir dam, and the idea was to create about 16 tents, and the whole structure has been kind of visualized and then created as something taking off from this tukdi chat idea, which is a very traditional way of building in some parts of our country, where you just lay stone over metal, simple metal frames. So it's a very frugal way of constructing. It's a very lightweight structure and fairly simplistic in terms of execution. And then we brought in this idea of handmade and bespoke furniture into the tents and the rooms themselves. So that gives that sense of luxury. So that's a master plan showing how the property has been laid out. The tents kind of oversee this large expanse of the reservoir, and it's a singular expression. So that's an elevational view. So what we've done is we've created a structural system where there are partition walls, and then the fabric kind of seamlessly stretches across the length of the built mass. That's another view from the side. That's a section for the main public facility, which houses the all-day dining and then oversees the pool, and then it allows you to step down into the landscape. That's an Art Deco inspired expression. Again, Rajasthan is very strongly kind of influenced by Art Deco. So a lot of palaces, and they pick on this movement that came from Europe and has become integral to a lot of architectural expression in Rajasthan. And then on the stone, we've worked with the local artisans to create this story of nature. It's a park that focuses on the environment around. So there's a lot of bird watching, animal movement around. That's what the property's proposition is. So they set up these safaris and kind of expeditions into the jungle around. So the entire story has been on the flora and fauna of the region. That's a view of the gallery outside the all-day dining, which allows you to look at the reservoir. Expressions like the bar counter has a hand-carved expression of the local birds. And all of this kind of happened as we interacted with the artisans available in the region and what we could do with them. So it was a fairly interesting process. There was a discovery of who would do what, and kind of we pulled in people. So for the tent, we brought in this textile designer who works with large block prints. So she created these massive blocks, and these are all hand printed, screen printed fabric tents, which have been kind of layered with interesting pieces of furniture to build a distinctive kind of character. So again, the furniture is inspired from a certain period look, which kind of fits in well. There is a very authentic use of raw timber wherever possible, in terms of the headboard for the bed, the large consoles that sit in the space. There's a skylight, which is very easy to kind of manage, a small skylight which has been inserted in the fabric structure. These are the impressions that different tents have. So we played with the color and the block prints and made the rooms come alive with a lot of detail in there. Then I'll move to another project that we did for the City Palace. The idea was to create a connection to the city dwellers, apart from the tourists who visit the City Palace, and transform an old cafe that existed as part of the museum grounds and create an F&B destination that would kind of pull people and give a sense of pride. Sorry for the typo on the dwellers, but it had to become an aspirational space. That's something that people would feel proud about, having that kind of space in their city and come back to it, because that was a disconnect that was happening. And one of the key challenges that we had was the connect of the central courtyard of the old cafe. So the cafe, and that's the experience of the old cafe. And there was a dividing wall which didn't allow for that connection of the courtyard to facing the city, connect directly into the space. So we kind of removed that central piece. We reprogrammed. So there were some interventions in the old structure, which we kind of looked at how the structures had evolved. We worked with the local conservation architects. We went into a debate with the Mehrangarh Trust and came up with this, the Jaipur City Palace Trust, and came up with a solution where we said we'll remove the structure, we'll put in an iconic object which would anchor the space, and that helped us transform the space and also create this very interesting dialogue of the old and new. So we picked up on the lines, the scale of the spaces around us, and we use the materials which are again local. So most of it is created using the local marble. There were new floors which were inserted. We chiseled off the plaster of the old structure because that was kind of completely not in shape, and there were artworks on it which over the years the skill had deteriorated and the artworks were not really something worthy of retaining. We kind of layered and built in, kind of cleaned up the lime plaster work, revealed the stone with the details in stone left intact. So it became like a canvas for our new object to be inserted in the space. And then, of course, a lot of prototyping. The entire column grid structure is inlit. So we tried different things with the marble layering, built the columns with an inlet detail. And again, some of these details are deco inspired, because that's something that really works and draws from the existing palatial grounds and the way the interior spaces have been rendered inside the palaces. So we kind of used that as a vocabulary because it existed on the grounds, and we wanted something in contrast with the shell, or rather the built mass that we had around. And most of this, I mean, all of it actually is done using local craftsmen. So all the stone work, the metal work, the joineries. So the same guys, same craftsmen have actually worked with us, developed new patterns, and created the floors using the marble that comes from 30-kilometer radius around from around Jaipur, basically. We selectively also retained a lot of the spaces which we felt had a sense of, which had a quality of artwork that needed to be retained, which was not destroyed over the times or kind of overdone. And then we cleaned up some spaces and brought in little details. So there was a lot of juxtaposition of the old and new. There was a sort of dialogue that got created. So you see that happening constantly through the space. Interpretation of traditional thickery work, either brought in as a pattern onto the floor or to the ceilings, on the walls. Yeah. So that's Baradri at the City Palace. Then I'll move to a completely different interpretation of Indian craft that we took on for, we got this opportunity to do a restaurant in Dubai. And the name of the brand was Masti. So the idea was to do a very quirky, playful take on India, and not. So we kind of pushed it, but and it sits within this context. You know, that's the facade of the building. And once you go in, there's a burst of color, and there's this, again, a very similar play of, you know, craft and contemporary expression of craft, but used in to intensify the experience of the restaurant and the bar. So it's pushed quite a bit, because the idea was to make it very playful and very, very exhilarating as an experience. So little details like the Onam pattern has been kind of transferred in brass strips onto a raw concrete floor and embedded in it and polished. We've created these large kind of gestures of brass screens and inserts of forms which are derived from local kind of vocabulary of Mughal architecture and mixed architecture that you see in the country. A lot of development on the textiles, and everything was kind of put together, and this is the lower space where we brought in this vibe of, the vibrancy that you see in our Indian markets. So layered with objects, and that's the bar at the lower level, which only kind of, the idea was to distinguish between the alcohol bar and the juice serving bar. So we brought in a sense of nature, and the motifs are more inspired from that. At the upper level, we did this very dramatic kind of backdrop for the bar, which is fully done in stained glass. And it's a giant elephant head that's been geometrically kind of created with stained glass, which forms a backdrop of a backlit bar. So that's the bar. All the lamps, furniture, I mean, a lot of the details were actually developed, manufactured, and then shipped from here. We did a shell fit out at the site, and everything was kind of put together as a story, created and shipped. So it's very intense in terms of its expression. So inlay work in the tables. We've created little board games on the tabletops in marble by inlaying marble. So we've used techniques which are very prevalent and which are easy to kind of work with, and given them new, repurpose them for kind of new use in the space. Like weaving techniques have been converted into these vibrant colors for the outdoor furniture. There were a lot of outdoor areas, which even the divan seating, which is a popular mode of seating from which has been reinterpreted. And the last project I want to take on is something that we are doing in Bombay, in Mumbai, which for Godrej. It's a large development. We've been working with them for the past 6-8 years now, and we are helping them create anchor objects and buildings within the premise. So we've done, I'm going to talk about the first building that we did there. Now we've also done a clubhouse for the residents there. We are right now working on a building for the main sculpture court that's coming up in the heart of the property. And what was really interesting was that this was one of the first developers which we really enjoyed collaborating with. They wanted to keep the legacy of the site alive and kind of give back a portion of the site and open up the gates of usually, what a gated community gets created, open up the gates of a portion of that to the city and pull the city back into it. So we've used some of those, and this is actually part of a large master plan where the factories are moving out of the city. So we are working with them to redevelop this area in a way where the old buildings are retained, which give a sense of place and a sense of connect to the past. So we started this journey by creating 2 buildings for them, which acted as their marketing experiences. And then slowly now they are getting transformed into F&B experiences. So this is how we found the site. And we kind of translated the building, how we would give it a personality as an entrance, a gateway to the entire development. And we did a little mini master plan where we could activate the buildings and a public space around it. So the yellows actually indicate some of the old buildings that we had earmarked to repurpose and use them. And we are right now still working on them. So that's a little map that shows how the connections would get built in the future. And on the right-hand side is the master plan that we had drawn up. So we had 2 old factory buildings. One was a generator plant. The other one was a storehouse, which have been repurposed. And then there was a boiler, like a skeleton that was holding a large boiler, which we converted into an F&B facility in the heart of the property. And then, of course, we built an amphitheater, and we pulled in some of the old silos, the tanks, which were used for the chemical plants, and used them for storytelling. So these are some views of how the building came together. And we selectively selectively kind of played with the materiality of the building. We pulled off all the factory, the old materials which were used as the factory shed, and removed stuff like the asbestos louvers and brought in this cotton steel as a material which would age over time. So we also wanted these buildings to find their place in the life of the development. So the louvers were perforated to mimic the way the light dapples to the trees on the side. So it kind of brings this dapple light into the interior of the space. And the shell itself, kind of ages as the cotton bleeds over it and covers the concrete shell. Some of the details. And also we ended up working with materials like copper and bronze for the doors so that they would age well. The idea was to actually have these be kind of repurposed for the next 30, 40 years or 50 years as the space would evolve. So slowly, some of these are getting converted into F&B experiences. The boiler setup was converted into a cafe that was actually taken over by one of the significant brands in the country, and they started running the facility. That became a hub. And the old tanks were repurposed for storytelling, which told the story about people who had worked on the site and the company, the Godrej legacy. Godrej has a huge legacy of how they hold their values, and they wanted to tell a story about reflecting what is important to them and how the development is going to kind of they would carry that forward. And that's how they kind of activate. This is the public space that got created for the city. So this is where art fairs happen. They kind of invite people, they do F&B events. And in a way, it's been a really nice experience to be participating with them, collaborating with them, creating this gesture for the city. And yeah, I think that was the last project that we wanted to share. We can probably jump into. Thank you. Pallavi, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. I was just saying that was a beautiful presentation, and thank you, Ankur and Siddharth, and such beautiful projects. Always a joy to watch those. And I would like to open up for a round of conversation between the three of you. And just being heedful of the time, I will also read out some of our audience questions, and probably you can include that in your conversation if that's possible. The question from Tina Patel, thank you for such a thoughtful and sorry, let me just move down. Thank you for such a thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. While all spaces are cultural spaces, seeing the case studies presented, would you say / argue that cultural spaces are spaces which have a capacity to be a social catalyst? Another question from Anya. In adaptive reuse projects, which culture dominates, the old or the new, or is it a hybrid? And finally, from Kurt, in our increasing digital and online culture, how can design preserve our cultural heritage while being proactive in this new arena? So just a few of the questions, and probably as we go forth, if we can mix those with your own thoughts, that'll be great.
Yeah. Ron, you want to go at it, and then I'll kind of add?
Yeah, I can start. So what a beautiful presentation, a beautiful and thoughtful work. And I have many pages of notes here in front of me, and a lot of questions to ask. So I know we won't get to all of them. So I'm going to try to prioritize, sort this a little bit. I was extremely interested in a theme that crossed several projects about how your studio uses material and craft as cultural opportunities, and particularly around the idea of forming collaborations. And so maybe, I guess the question is, could you just speak a little bit about when you are experimenting with materials and meeting collaborators and prototyping, like how do those material investigations and material problem solving also become part of a cultural dialogue in the work?
Yeah. I mean, to start with, I think collaboration is something that allows for this dialogue to get created. So in a way, when we work with people who are in the business of building and executing, we go with a sort of premise that yes, one knows from our past experience that there's a certain way of doing it, but the freedom of the person adding and kind of building on it has to be always available, and that something has helped us. So there's this constant kind of I would say urge to learn from people who build with us, and somewhere collaboration allows for that to come alive, and there's this sharing of energy. There is like this back and forth that happens where you don't feel that like I think what Sid spoke about, it's a very different feeling. There's this sense of connect with people, which is most important. So you might have done it, you might have a certain skill, you might have a certain understanding, but somewhere I think giving that space and allowing for something to emerge, and I think Ambrish spoke a lot about it. So, but there's this huge sense of surprise that comes when we work with people, and that's been so exciting for all of us. And it's been a personal journey, I think, individually for all of us. And that's why we keep going back to, even though it's challenging, like Sid said, sometimes the way people work, the communities are differently aligned. There's a language issue. There's so many challenges that will come up. But the hands-on way of working is something that I think that's a way of how we like to operate and build, and it excites us. It kind of energizes us. Yeah. Sorry, Sid, you were adding.
No, I was just to add the two parts. Our process of building in our context again has many layers. It's obviously we are talking about the future, but there is so much past, and there must so much layers to it, and so much to imbibe from, so much to take away from, that I think we just try to keep some of those fundamental ways of building, and then the fundamental ways of principles by how they would have made. We kind of keep that in mind, to keeping in any project. So I think just to, just the notion of a master craftsman, and probably just to take that from there, that, okay, how at this point, if we were to build, what probably in especially in Rajasthan, because there is so much available, and how a master craftsman would build it, and how we can learn from, from there. So rather than us coming up with our solutions, I think, I think what also helps is there are no perfect drawings. We our work is not very mechanized, so maybe we are fortunate not to put a set of drawings over there and, now, hey, you build it. We just put across an idea, we throw it open, the clients are on our side of the table. They want to understand this process, rather than saying, okay, some of the projects haven't had facades till the very end. Like Jodhpur, I remember, we have made multiple iterations, and then probably the Jodhpur facade came up. So probably not being so mechanized is helping us, probably having a dialogue in each and every moment with every craftsman, with whether it's a carpenter or a stone guy, how to purchase stone, again, helps that dialogue. Can we save money in purchasing stone? So there's just so many layers to it. And it does go a lot of back and forth. It does not culminate, but this whole process of prototyping and learning and seeing that how can we make it better has helped us, I guess, and it shapes our process of building. Yeah.
So can I extend that question, though, a little bit further, maybe? You guys opened with the quote, "Culture shapes architecture," and then the question, "Can design shape culture?" So in reflecting on those material collaborations and those conversations, do you see the resultance of that as being a pathway or a lever to then begin to shape like larger cultural either relationships or conversations past and beyond the constructing of the project itself? So like I'll just say I was extremely interested in the agricultural ministry or agricultural directorate building that you guys presented, and talking about or trying to imagine the experience of that ground plane, you know, after the building is completed, after the construction innovations and conversations have taken place, the kind of cultural emergences that perhaps seeds or solicits, you know, in that community, and how those might be related to that craft and making collaborations and dialogues. So I don't know if that was a clear question, but if you guys could maybe reflect a little bit, or I can clarify if you need.
I guess no. Let me try answering. Like in my visits, like we have done studies even after handing over, and then those upstream visits where we have been in conversation with the government to you know, there have been some challenges and we had to mitigate those. So we've been in close touch with each other, and in those visits to that place, every time I have seen, whether in the morning or towards the evening, while the government setup is engaged over those 3 floors, I have seen you know, a lot of events happening. So you know, the auditorium being actively used by the neighboring schools. Like we probably never imagined that. You know, we did give in a small auditorium, and maybe it was not. In fact, I would say now in hindsight, maybe not perfectly planned for larger events or whatever engagements. But yeah, I saw schools using it. Or for example, I see Krishi Bhavan being on, to an extent, a little touristic map. Like I've come across people who have made it a point to see this, you know, as an from an architecture point of view, to you know, to go through the space and sit there and out there, and it's open, so there are no boundary, as I mentioned, you know, unlike the police headquarters next to it. So people can walk in, walk out, they can actually go and sit. So I've seen people just hanging around, you know, taking shade, you know, because Bhubaneswar as a city is very hot and humid. So you know, I've seen groups sitting out there eating food, for example. So it's actually, you know, it's actually out there. There are no boundary. So we never thought of those kind of connections. Maybe citizens and tourists have had a much larger engagement, apart from you know, farmers engaging with it. So probably this gesture has broadened the horizon. Like government has understood this as a point of conversation and a larger engagement. It was a struggle in the beginning. They wanted like a glass box, you know, like from Delhi or from Dubai, and it was a lot of discussion where they finally understood the meaning of going frugal, going back, and then working with the local materials. And in fact, now you see even the government being proud of it. They couldn't see the results early on, but when they saw this happening and saw the way the building is shaping up and people reacting to it, they themselves reacting to it, they saw all of that. And then I guess even the people who made it, typically, you know, in our area, government tenders, you know, they just make it. They don't think much about, you know, why. I think they just have to follow the BOQs and the drawings and just. But you know, I could see the people involved having a sense of pride, you know, making it even to that extent. Maybe, I don't know, I could answer it in some way. Yeah.
If I may add to your question, Ron, then did you have any say in the program of what kind of spaces to, as you said, probably the auditorium, was it asked for? Did you provide new kinds of spaces inside so that which could cater to this, to the users in some way, and change the culture of their working? If as we are talking about, you know, how does it influence them operating in that system, and probably that building really providing a platform for a better social change to happen? And that goes back to Tina's question of it acting almost as a social catalyst.
Yeah, to a very large extent. Firstly, to answer to your first question, these programs were added. As I mentioned, when we looked at Königsberger planning, it was mentioned that the city and the building are integrated, and I think that was approved by the government to add these facilities, such as the seating areas, the landscape areas, the auditorium, some offices, for farmers and government officials to interact, even the roof terrace becoming an urban farming exercise. And then beyond that, as I mentioned, these were added on, these were our suggestions. And to the extent that even citizens are playing a much larger role and using it as a place to sit and congregate and meet up, probably, yes, we had given facilities such as a cafe, which is yet to take form in full way. But the idea was that even some amount of interaction through food and those kind of conversations to happen. We have given spaces for that. But again, the challenge again being for a government to really, which we we realized that for the government to take like 100% U-turn is difficult. Like for them, it's a slow engagement. It will take time. It will need a constant kind of back and forth. We can't just provide and move away. That's been our learning. Like we've been at it. So maybe after a year, the urban farming got over. It didn't happen in the first time. It had solar panels. It has some, Azolla pools, and a lot of hand holding. Like I think, need to go away from the aspect of being architect and, maybe we've given our drawings and they've done their work, and maybe not, but we had to handhold. And I think for us, it became very critical to do post-operation study, to keep on being at it, to take care of the leftover points. And maybe the next step would be to maybe we did speak about an event, like any a place like this is run probably by a museum kind of an organizer, or by the art curator. Somebody of that nature needs to get seeped into their setup, who can look at programming these events and making it a much more larger engagement. That is yet to happen. We had given them ideas, but probably it needs to be pushed further to even become, like an area program person of sorts, yet to happen. Right? But a lot of hand-holding has happened to make headway, and a lot of work still needs to be done. I think it's not easy especially with the government, to just provide and we feel it would happen. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, and Pallavi, I just wanted to link it back to, I think, one of the questions that you pulled up from the audience, whether someone was saying that can it be argued that all cultural spaces have the capacity to be a social catalyst? And in a way, this is a very good example, because somewhere government buildings in our urban fabric today have the largest footprint, or sort of they have the access to the largest footprint available. And in a way, if that space becomes interacts and becomes a space for the public to kind of come in and opens up its doors to the environment, the residents and the public around, it is responding to that idea of, like the space facilitating something that is the need of the time. And our cities really need that today. And in that sense, even, this idea of the craft in our country is struggling because there's a lot of mechanized kind of ways of doing things that have come in, and the people who had their skills, specialized skills with hands, are moving away from what they used to do because there's no economy that's supporting that. So somewhere in that sense, getting the government excited to be the patrons and actually pull in 300, 400 craftsmen to create an iconic building addresses, the idea of what we could do to influence and actually bring a larger perspective to the society, and how it could be looked at. And yeah, I mean, that's what we experience, and that's the opportunity. Absolutely.
I think that's a great opportunity, right? Architects not as form givers, just tangible form givers, but this idea of social change and the cultural mode of practice. But Ron, would you like to also comment on the idea of adaptive reuse, and what kind of a culture is that producing? because we had a culture, and that probably that space was an outcome of a particular culture at a time. And we are reusing that. And Ankur and Sid, you have various projects that actually do that, right? Reusing. And how do you see that, Ron? Probably you and then.
So I have the luxury to answer of having not have to answer the clients. So the question asks about the culture of the past or the culture of the present. Which one should predominate? To me, and this is maybe a more theoretical point, I'm less interested in ideas of like cultural purity, you know? I think that I'm most interested in the idea of culture as a kind of living force. And obviously, like every person who is alive, I hope, the thought about making the world better today, and also to add another time frame, making the world better tomorrow. And so the relation, and I, you know, and I'm a historian, so I'm deeply interested in questions of the past. And I find, you know, I don't see that the past is gone. I think we live in the past very much, but I don't feel any obligation to it. It's not my master. It's simply my conversant, or sometimes my maybe I'm its prisoner more than I'm, you know, have to safeguard it. But it's not a question for me of preserving some sort of pure sense of the past. It's about being in a set of dialogues and relationships. And to me, the ultimate measure is neither the past nor the present. The ultimate yardstick, if there has to be just one, is the future. So maybe that's too much of an abstract answer to a very smart, good question. But I guess I would say, I think our obligation is to look forward and to put culture into motion for all of our betterments.
I think that's a very smart answer to a very smart question. And Ankur and Sid, do you want to add anything to that? Your project.
No, I would say that we've actually experimented a lot with it. And Ron, I mean, you might say that it's abstract, but it actually makes a lot of sense, because I mean, that's what we bring on board when we are evaluating our decisions on, you know, what works for the space, or what are the kind of interventions that will, which will bring value and take it into the future, and retain what we need to retain from the past and make it valuable today. And I think this bridging of what should be shaped and retained from the past, it's always a balance. And to answer the question, that there's nothing that really dominates, probably it all depends on what story one wants to kind of live into from the past and retain and hold close from the architecture or from the space that we are working in. So, and even simple things like, for example, in this Baradari structure, we ended up working a lot on figuring out ways in which we could contain some of the spaces, because the palaces really didn't have, you know, there are these deep veranda seamless spaces which were usually used as outdoor spaces. But given the norms of thermal comfort that we all live in today, and there are moments in those 2 months, 3 months in the year where the temperatures go beyond bearable kind of parameters. And for that, and also retaining this idea of, you know, what the operational cost should be for the premise, and only creating a very small portion of contained conditioned areas and still retaining most of the areas as outdoor areas. So those kind of choices are made on the premise that Ron, you're talking about. Like it is kind of looking into the future. It's looking into what is the best way to sustain this facility, and you know, make sure that it kind of lives up to the aspiration, as well as it's practically kind of feasible for the times that we are living in. So absolutely, yeah.
You know, just to add, there's so much abundance of rich heritage and structures, which again in India we find, and whenever we encounter some of these structures, I think one lens we put on is, you know, like is there a need to build it again? Like for us, just using them as it is versus making them again is a lens we apply, and based on that lens, we all agree to adding to Ron's point. It's difficult. We in no way are trying to recreate the past, but yes, if we can restore it and program it to what Ankur was saying in a certain way, how can we do more with less? That's another filter we apply. But 100% to what Ron said, yes. And some of the projects which we are doing now, we are working on the future, how we can build it with ease, how we can probably mechanize it, how we can pre-engineer it. Some of our works reflected at some of our other works which we haven't shown reflects it more, but keep putting again the filter of future in mind. The more and more we are working on different terrains and difficult terrains, in fact, and how we can easily make it, and that's the way, that's the way to build now. And then whatever nuances of past and craft and connections we can draw, that is kind of synced in a certain future, whatever, in a easy way to build or a future way to build. Yeah.
I think Andrea added to Kurt's question, where Kurt had asked about a digital and online culture and how can design preserve our cultural heritage while being proactive in this new digital arena. And Andrea asks, Ron had shared the Fillmore Auditorium and spoke of counterculture in space. With so much counterculture now existing online, are we witnessing the potential extinction of counterculture space in the built environment? A very difficult question, I would say, Ron.
Yeah, I think you're right, Pallavi, to link those two together. Maybe I'll dodge and sort of half answer both. Try to maybe hand it off to my partners here who work more with technology every day and truly will have more to say than I do about this. But I'm going to take a very contrarian view toward this question, I think, which is that putting my historian hat on, I think about our current kind of technological revolution as being actually part and parcel of an ongoing technological revolution that I see as being the basis of why we call ourselves modern people. So I think about modern people living in a kind of rolling series of technological revolutions that go back to the 1850s. And so in that sense, I'm a little skeptical to think that we are beginning a completely new chapter. I mean, obviously I recognize digital technologies are different than internal combustion technologies, different than telegraph technologies, but if we can take a larger perspective and see that for centuries, we have been thinking about what it means to live in a kind of constant and accelerating experience of technological change. We actually have a tremendous amount to learn from people whose world was electrified, who first met electricity, or who first met human flight, or who first met railroad transit, that their worlds were as upturned as our world has been. And so the question about the relationship between the kind of accelerating change in the present and connection to the past, which is, I think, part of Kurt's question, has been an ongoing question for modern people, global people, for centuries. And so in that sense, I don't know that we need to say, I'm less inclined to say how different it is for us now, and more to say how similar it is to what has been a kind of ongoing question or problematic or crisis for generations. So, but obviously things are specific and different, and we have all been, trapped in our homes for a year. We spend our time communicating with our fellows this way on Zoom calls. So I don't know, I actually have my appointment for my vaccine today, and I sit in bed and I just dream about going back to a restaurant, and being surrounded by a crowd. So I'm not so worried that that we have lost the spatialization of our cultural practices, but I do see them as shifting a lot. And so I don't want to oversimplify. So with that dodge, maybe I'll turn it over to Siddhartha and Ankur, who use contemporary tools much more as part of their work probably than I do.
This is I guess it's a question that keeps coming up, but more and more we are realizing that what Ron pointed out, probably, it's never going to be black and white. There's always going to be this, and that's how we look at technology. We always use it as a tool, as an advantage. So in a way, I think we should embrace the grace, the kind of efficiency, or whatever you say, the kind of flair that technology gives us to deal with challenges of our times. But more and more in all our spaces, from hospitality to retail, I mean, all the storytelling is actually happening in the physical world, and we are opening up to that whole domain where people are coming back to create, even though they might be efficiently managing to do a fair amount of interaction online, they would want to create a physical space which is tactile, which will bring people together, which will create a space for energy exchanges to happen. And I think that's a learning for all of us as well. Like post lockdown, and for the longest time we kind of worked, as Ron was describing, over Zoom, and we all felt, of course, the fatigue of just sitting in front of the screen, but also psychologically and spiritually, I think every one of us experienced this lack of exchange of physical energy that happens when you kind of collaborate and sit across a table and work. So I think there is no way around it, and technology will always be something by the side. I don't think it'll ever take over. So yeah, I mean, that's my thought.
No, just very in short, even I took some notes about Nelson, and he mentioned about humane environments. And I think in our context in India, as Ankur mentioned last, I think, yes, our spaces can become technologically advanced and all of that, but we would cease to thrive and exist on humane, in contact, meeting each other, and all of that. Now, whether it's events or offices, as he mentioned, like the bulk of our work really happened when we kind of started meeting each other. Yes, we've become more proactive and productive, probably on Zoom calls and all, but our actual physical work on design probably took shape when some close meetings happened. So I think for us, meaning how much technology can take over, for us, it will still remain, when you are meeting each other and all of that. Yeah.
I'll say one more thing on this, Pallavi, to jump in. When I look at the slides from Studio Lotus that we saw this morning, I also am so acutely aware of how much I long for the embodied experience of those kind of magical dappled lights, the color palettes that you guys showed, the beautiful textiles, the magical sort of low relief surfaces chiseled into stone, that those are, I'm aware of how much I'm missing, seeing them only optically and not as part of my like embodied physical environment. And so I think that one of the things which is so smart and so like resolved in your work is actually around the scale of the body, which was really magical and beautiful. And that's something that needs our bodies to be there, to experience. So I say it as, for me, a call and invitation that I need to get one day on an airplane to be in some of these rooms that we saw this morning.
Let's plan that together, Ron, with our students, I guess. But just looking at the time, I didn't realize that we've been on this for 2 hours. And we did have a little question answer planned. And what I would do is probably just ask those questions quickly. And as Ron had suggested, maybe you can dodge the questions, be brief about it. And just so that, we kind of stick to that structure. And also, those questions are more to open up more conversations, and probably we get this set of webinars into a publication form later. Maybe those are questions that can be dwelled on and thought of more if we were to develop it further. So I will hand it quickly to four of our team here and have those questions asked now.
All right.
Thank you, Ron, Ankur, and Siddharth for those wonderful presentations. So our first question was for Ron. So when looking back to history and how design was influenced by culture and tradition, do you think that design nowadays can impact and change the way we practice culture, including like values and norms?
Yes. That's the no, absolutely yes. My whole presentation was trying to show how that has been, to encourage that. I see all of our work as being, a cultural practice, and of course, a designer can embrace that. They can take it on and try to operate, or they can let it happen to them. But I don't see any alternative where it's like there's no culture at stake in what we tried to do. So the question that a designer faces today is, do I want to be a cultural actor? Do I want to try to use my design work to make cultural changes? Or do will just be, I'll deal with something else. I'm thinking about like design has other questions as well. And that then the cultural things will just happen nonetheless. But there's no position outside of those cultural relationships.
Right. Thank you, Ron. So now our second question is for Ankur and Siddhartha. When trying to introduce a culture through design in another geographical location, what are the challenges that your team face to guide users not familiar with that culture to feel welcome while keeping the main principle of that specific culture?
So I think, like both of us mentioned, it is a challenge, and it all depends, and that's something that we spend a lot of time. So we kind of use the initial part of the brief building exercise as this premise, and kind of create our parameters of understanding. We bounce the right kind of questions across, and that's the kind of homework that is needed to circumvent the challenges that you're talking about. And it's not that there's a solution or there's a simple way through, but yeah, just being conscious of it, being aware, being very sensitive through the process. And as Siddharth mentioned, it's very layered, it's very nuanced, because you are talking about communities, you're talking about people's emotions and their understanding of how socially they've been kind of dealing with it. So there's a huge divide between regions. So when you go into a new region, just the manner in which you speak or the way you kind of would like to push something forward doesn't come across as a it might not sit well with on the other side. So there are lots of things that one needs to learn. So every time we go into a project, there is that initial phase, which is like where we build our muscle to kind of understand the project deeply enough. So we spend a lot of time with our clients, with our context of people who we are going to work with. There are instances where we've taken teams from one region to another region to train them to create something and build for us. So those are the kind of things that you need to do, especially when you're dealing with cultural challenges, because there are parts of the country where a certain kind of work is not done anymore. It's been lost over time, or people just don't do it anymore. So you have to take stone workers from Rajasthan and move them to the hills just to get a certain kind of work done. And so it's a very very engaging and very elaborate kind of hand holding that needs to be done to make things come alive. But it's also very joyful when you get to do it and it happens. Yeah,
I think it's the process of working by hand is very critical, in a sense that in India we have about 17 geographic zones and another, I think, about 11 climatic zones, food, so much variety that wherever we are in all these locations, I think, again, using the local principles, local materials is the starting point to having an engagement with the artisans or the craftsmen or the builders. And then on top of it, a lot of prototyping. While we are prototyping, while we are trying to come up with the correct detail, here's the process is when you engage and when you communicate and you participate. And I guess that is how, I think the end product gets shaped up. As I mentioned earlier, it's not really about sending a drawing and that will get made. Yes, the drawing is made for the purpose of becoming a tool for engagement and communication. And that's where dialogues happen. And we are able to actually handhold everyone to come beyond beyond that intent. It's you might have put it on paper, but it actually shapes us when we are all there. We are understanding the material, we are understanding how it can be laid over conversation, and that's how it happens. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question for Ron. How does this notion of cultural practice affect the course you teach? And can you explain the typical assignment that constitute your course? And while talking about what role technology take it all of that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. So of course, I teach in a studio program. We have lots of things that we work on. So it would be wrong to say everything is cultural work at every moment, like there's work on tectonics, there's work on spatial organization, problem solving. We have to do those things. But certainly in upper level studios, I like to explicitly frame projects, briefs as much as possible in their kind of social and cultural situations and complexities. So that projects begin with a theoretical phase and a research phase in which these questions, as much as I can, become like foregrounded in the type of project we're going to do, and of course we do a full range of project types, from very conceptual ones to more practical ones across all space categories, like any program. But to insist and that the project begins by framing it, not to be a burden, not to make it more difficult, but to open the possibility of the project, is to see it within these kind of cultural horizons. So that usually means some theoretical reading, some watching things, films, artworks, some seminar discussions that help to open those kind of questions, which then, I encourage students to then take positions against or in response to, right? Like within this territory, like what kind of position do you wish your project to stake out? And then we need to then develop and work that project. And then the last part of the question was about technology, I think, yes. And, there is a culture of technology, and that's a long answer. The short answer is, as much as I can, I like to see technology in studio as a tool. And it's relevant and helpful and important for the questions we're trying to ask. So, but if it's not the right tool, then we find some other tool.
So thank you, Ron. My question for Ankur and Sitar: how do you apply your knowledge of the elements and principles of design in order to effectively create interior space that are reflective of a specific culture? And how do you manage to design a space or building that maintain the cultural answers while also ensures that it stands out uniquely? Thank you.
So, I mean, you might say that we keep saying the same thing, but again, it's a lot of experimenting and prototyping, because we usually stay away from kind of recreating something. So there's always this idea of reinterpreting it and finding a solution which can be made or which you can experience as a relevant expression. So through most of our work, one of the biggest challenges is not to try and bring in something just for the sake of its existence because it has existed in the past. So we always try and find a story that will excite us for the future. So like, for example, again, I'll go back to the same Jodhpur project where I think we spent about 4 or 5 months creating screens as motifs, and we realized that personality that the screens were getting because of our inspiration coming from the past was not working for us as a creation for the future, and it kind of was locking it into it wasn't making it timeless basically. And that was the key intent, that we wanted the building to have a sense of connect to the cultural context of the Jali, and use the Jali for its essence, which is basically to shield the building from the thermal intensity that you experience in Rajasthan. But the motifs were adding a layer of story that was just not becoming relevant for the proposition that we were creating. And at the end of the whole exercise, we ended up creating something which was very neutral. It actually became fairly functional, but we just played around with the proportions so that it brought in the delicate character that a Jali usually brings into the architectural mass. And that was the only nuance that we kind of picked up and developed on. So yeah, so in that sense, it's usually it's not easy, and it takes a lot of time to arrive at something that does justice to kind of what do you say, kind of be created physically in its or to bring something into a physical existence and say that it's been inspired from a culture or a past, because there's always a story that we are trying to play with and build on. So that's what takes time, and it's a narrative that one creates for your own self, for the process, for the teams that are working on it, and for the larger picture, which is, you know, the brand or the business that's going to kind of use that story to leverage its positioning. So that's the effort that one puts in to understand the culture and what we are going to imbibe from it, what's the interpretation we'll create, and then put it out there, which sits with the relevant requirements of the building program, the architectural massing, or the interior spaces that we are creating, and how it all kind of weaves in together. So yeah, it's not, I mean, it's very difficult to answer in a few words like that. Yeah.
I'll try in a very short way again. And that's kind of a revelation. It occurred to me while going through the presentation that, you know, let me answer it in this way, that we went through a few projects, and I also wrote that, you know, we have done column detailing of different projects in a certain way. So, and I think that is influenced by, apart from the craftsmen working on it and the material available and all of that, but it also has a little cultural impact. So while we saw the call, and it has its metal and then stone cladding, but in a palace in Baradri, the stone is marble, so it's rich. It is, you know, fluted, so it's richly carved because of, let's say, the palatial context to it. Whereas in Telangana, it is more robust and basic, true to its form because of its nature. And probably in Baradri, you know, I could see the column being shaped, curved, you know, trying to, because of it being a resort or you know, having some softness to it. So yeah. I think in Chhatrasagar, sorry. So in somewhere, you know, whether it's obviously the context is there, but even somewhere these kind of realms also add on because of certain cultural nuances, and it gives shape. So even a very simple aspect of how the column has been detailed in different projects, and it could be our next you know, feature. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's what I was thinking, Siddharth. Thank you so much for bringing that in. And I thank you so much for your time today. And it's been a very stimulating conversation. Lots of things that we can probably pull out, as Siddharth said, and bring in as new webinar topics or in person, hopefully. And by next year.
Yeah.
We could meet somewhere and have these
Okay.
fascinating conversations. But thank you so much, Ron, Ankur, and Siddharth. It's been such a pleasure having you here and listening to your thoughts and looking at some of your works. And thank you for my lovely organizing team who have done a lot of work to put this together. And finally, I want to say for the audience too, they've been super nice with those questions. I think that really got our conversation going. These webinars will be available for viewing later on the YouTube channel. So if you want to go in there and view, please subscribe to the channel because we'll have more of these conversations coming in. And next week, we have our final 2 webinars, which deal with material culture. Very fascinating view of how radio or film or television affect these cultural ideas. So I think if you want to tune in for that, it'll be nice. One is on Wednesday on the 24th and the other one is on 27th. So please tune in if you want. And thank you once again to everyone here.
Thank you, Pallavi. Thank you, all of you guys.
Whenever you guys plan, we would love to revisit Jodhpur and Chhatrasagar with you guys.
Absolutely. We will plan that soon and hopefully have you over in Canada as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ron.
Thanks,
Thank
Ron.
you.
Lovely talking to you.
Nice to talk with you guys. Thank you,
Yep.
Pallavi, and all
Thank you.
students
Thank
for
you.
hosting us.
Bye now.